This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, and welcome to the 2023-24 Financial Aid presentation. This presentation is brought to you by Mapping Your Future. Mapping Your Future is a South Dakota nonprofit organization funded by the South Dakota Education Access Foundation, which is part of the South Dakota Community Foundation. I'm Kathy Mueller, Executive Director of Mapping Your Future, and Mapping Your Future's mission is to help students succeed. And as a part of that, we provide a website for students, parents, counselors, and other professionals at southdakota.mappingyourfuture.org. On this website, we provide college, career, financial aid, and financial literacy information and services. Our agenda for today's presentation includes covering paying for college. Specifically, we're going to cover the free application for federal student aid. We'll talk about the programs in South Dakota, as well as share some other resources that are available for you. When you think about paying for education, there are 4 resources that most people consider, and that includes savings, and that could be savings of either the student or the parent, current earnings. And what we mean by that, it could be current earnings of the student who may be working a part-time job, or current earnings of the parent. For example, when my daughters were in college, I used part of my current earnings to help pay for their education, and that helped cut down on student loans. Of course, there's financial aid, and we're going to talk about that during this presentation. And of course, there are tax credits and deductions. Now, tax credits and deductions don't necessarily help you pay for an education, but they do help offset the cost of an education. And so we include them here to remind you to take advantage of any tax credits and deductions that are available to you when you file your tax return. The FAFSA process includes the following 4 steps, and these are at a high level. The student will complete the free application for federal student aid. A few days or a week later, the student will receive a student aid report, and we'll show an example of what that looks like later in the presentation. Later in the fall, or most likely in the spring, the student will receive a financial aid offer or award letter from the school. The student and parent will review that financial aid offer and decide what financial aid they want to accept. There are 4 types of financial aid. Grants and scholarships are the best types of financial aid. We usually call that gift aid because typically students don't have to repay grants and scholarships. We say typically because grants and scholarships can come with requirements or obligations, such as a requirement of a certain GPA or an obligation to enter a certain career field. If the student fails to meet those requirements or obligations, they could lose the grant or scholarship or have to repay it. So while grants and scholarships are the best kind of aid, it's important that students understand the requirements and obligations with that aid. There are work-study programs, and these are federal need-based programs. With work-study programs, students are offered a job either on campus or off campus, and they can work that job and earn money that they can then use for any expense, particularly education-related expenses. And finally, there are loans. And when a student completes the free application for federal student aid, they're determining their basic eligibility for federal student loans. There are other applications that the student will need to complete. In addition to federal loans, there are some states that offer state loan programs. And finally, students can borrow private loans from banks, credit unions, and other financial institutions. What is the FAFSA? The FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. It's the base application for various forms of financial aid, both need-based and non-need-based. And in addition to applying for federal student aid, many states require the FAFSA for their scholarship programs. Many institutional aid programs require the FAFSA, and what we mean by that are that colleges, schools, universities often require the FAFSA for their institutional aid. And there are even some private foundations that require the FAFSA for their private scholarship programs. Sometimes a student will say they don't want to fill out the FAFSA because they don't want any federal student loans and they don't think they'll qualify for any federal need-based aid. However, as you can see, because many other organizations and government agencies use the FAFSA information, it's important for the student to go ahead and complete the FAFSA. And the FAFSA became available on October 1 for the 23-24 academic year. And we do encourage students to complete the FAFSA as soon as possible because some aid, particularly institutional aid, may be provided on a first-come, first-served basis. And in addition, many institutions have what they call priority deadlines. And you'll want to make sure you're aware of that priority deadline to make sure you file the FAFSA by that date. To file the FAFSA, the student will go to studentaid.gov. In fact, this is the website that the student will need to remember for all of their federal financial aid. They'll complete the FAFSA here, but they'll also go here to view their student aid report. This is where they'll make any corrections, view their correction history, add missing signatures, and then in following years, for as long as they want to remain eligible for federal financial aid, they'll need to complete and submit a renewal FAFSA. To prepare for the FAFSA, one of the tools that the U.S. Department of Education offers is the FAFSA on the Web worksheet. To find it, just Google FAFSA on the Web worksheet 2324. Now, this worksheet is for the student and parents' purposes only, and they should not submit it anywhere, but it does have some of the questions that you may see on the FAFSA, as well as information about the types of documents you're going to need to complete the FAFSA. We've broken down completing the FAFSA into 10 steps, and we're going to go through each one of these steps. The first step is to create an FSA ID, and to do that, the student and at least one parent will go to studentaid.gov and click on Create Account. Basically, to create an FSA ID, you're creating an account at studentaid.gov. So the student and one parent will enter their personal information, and each of them will create a username and password. They'll enter their email address. Now, it's important to note the student and parent cannot share an FSA ID, nor can they share an email address that they use to create an FSA ID. Also, with regard to the email address, we recommend that students don't use a school email address and parents don't use a work email address because students may not have access to that email if they graduate, and then parents may not have access to the email if it's a work email and they change jobs. So it's important to use a personal email address that you're going to have access to in the future, particularly if you need to retrieve your username or password. You're going to have access to that email address. You'll create some security questions and then submit your information. And new this year is multi-factor authentication. And you'll need to set that up either using texting or email or a multi-factor authentication app. The FSA ID will have several functions for both the student and the parent. For the student, they're going to use that FSA ID to sign into their account at studentaid.gov, to retrieve any tax information if they need to sign the FAFSA. If they decide to take out student loans, they're going to use that FSA ID to apply for direct loans. And also, as a requirement of direct loans, the student will need to complete loan counseling, and so they'll need the FSA ID for that. And then in the future, the student will use the FSA ID to access their aid history on studentaid.gov. And if the student does have student loans and they want to change their repayment plan, they're going to need the FSA ID for that as well. For the parent, they're going to use their FSA ID to sign in to studentaid.gov, to retrieve tax information for the FAFSA, to sign the FAFSA for a dependent student, and then if the parent decides to take out student loans for their student, they'll need that FSA ID to apply for a Direct Plus parent loan. We list out the documents you're going to need to complete the FAFSA, and we're going to go through these documents as we go through the FAFSA. The first step is to log in to the FAFSA. And to do that, either the student or the parent can start the FAFSA. We think it's a little simpler if the student begins the FAFSA, but whoever starts the FAFSA will choose their profile and then fill in some personal information. And then the next step is to choose the appropriate FAFSA. For a while there's going to be 2 FAFSAs out there, so it's very important that the student choose the correct FAFSA. Students who are seniors this year and planning to go to post-secondary education next year will choose the 23-24 FAFSA form. The student can then create a save key for their FAFSA. And what this does is it allows the student to return to the FAFSA at the point where they stopped completing it. Now, I do want to say that the FAFSA will save as the student completes each section. So this save key can be used to return to the FAFSA, but also if the student and parent are not in the same place completing the FAFSA, the student can complete their portion of the FAFSA and then give their save key to their parent. And when the parent logs in to their account, they can use that save key to be connected to their student's FAFSA. The first section on the FAFSA is student demographics. And here it's important that the student get their name and Social Security number as it appears on their Social Security card. I often recommend that students have their Social Security card in front of them when they're completing this section of the FAFSA. If a student gets their Social Security number wrong, it could delay their financial aid. Also on the demographics, with regard to driver's license, if a student does not have a driver's license, they can leave that field blank. The residency and citizenship questions are to determine eligibility for some financial aid programs. The student will be asked about their high school completion status, and seniors will enter that they will have a high school diploma when they begin their post-secondary education. It will also ask some questions about the student's post-secondary plans, including the grade level they will be, the degree pursued, and whether or not this is their first bachelor's degree. Again, these are questions to determine eligibility for federal financial aid. If a student has some dual credit, they will still enter that they have never attended post-secondary education, and this will be their first year in college. Students will also be asked about their interest in federal work study. And as you may recall, I mentioned it was a need-based program, but I recommend all students answer yes to this question. First of all, your situation could change. And then also, it's not going to hurt anything to go ahead and say yes. If a student answers yes and they don't have financial need, they just won't be offered federal work study. If a student answers yes and they do have financial need and they're offered work study but don't want it, they can always turn it down. So it's not going to hurt anything to go ahead and answer yes. Students will also be asked if they've ever been in foster care, and they will be asked about their parent education completion. Again, these are questions to determine eligibility for some financial aid programs. Also, with regard to parent education completion, the Department of Education asks that question to determine the number of first-generation college students completing the FAFSA. Students will be asked to enter the name of their high school, and here they will start entering the name of their high school, and a pop-up screen will appear, and the student will select the appropriate school. This is to help weed out diploma mills. Now, this is the fun part of the FAFSA, where the student will enter the names of the schools that they want to receive their FAFSA information. So any school that a student is interested in attending, they can list in this area of the form. Very similar to the high school portion of the FAFSA. They'll start entering the name of the school, and a pop-up screen will appear with the names of similar schools, and they can select the appropriate one. Again, this is not a part of the admissions process, so students are not being committed to anything by listing a school here on the FAFSA. Students should complete the admissions applications separately. After they list all the schools they're interested in attending, the student will indicate their housing plans. And what they want to know is, will the student live in a dormitory on campus, off campus in an apartment, or off campus with their parents? This information will help the financial aid office at the school determine a cost of attendance for the student. And we're going to talk about cost of attendance a little bit later in this presentation. Now, there are some important terms that we want to discuss that we will see on the next section of the FAFSA, and that is dependent versus independent students, who is the parent, how many are in the household, and the number in college. First of all, dependent versus independent. The FAFSA is trying to determine whether the student is a dependent student or an independent student. Students who are independent will not need to provide parent information. Dependent students will need to provide parent information. If a student can answer yes to any one of those criteria that you see on the screen, they will be considered an independent student and will not provide parent information. However, if they answer no to all of those questions, they will be considered a dependent student and will need to provide parent information. Most high school students are considered dependent students and will need to provide parent information, but there are exceptions, including unaccompanied homeless youth. To be considered unaccompanied homeless youth, they need to fit into all three criteria: not in the physical custody of a parent, lacking fixed, regular, and adequate housing, and 23 years of age or younger. It also needs to be certified by a social service organization or a school. Now, sometimes students who are considered dependent still cannot provide parent information. So they do have an opportunity on the FAFSA to indicate that they are unable to provide parent information. However, if they do indicate they cannot provide parent information but are considered a dependent student, the school will be obligated to reach out to that student and find out why they cannot provide parent information on the FAFSA and determine whether or not a dependency override is justified. So who is the parent for FAFSA purposes? The parent is the student's biological and or adoptive parents who are considered their legal parents. Now, sometimes students will live with grandparents, foster parents, legal guardians, other siblings perhaps, or other relatives, but those are not considered the student's parents unless they have legally adopted the student. We've had situations where students are living with a grandparent and the grandparent wanted to fill out the FAFSA using their financial information. However, because they had not legally adopted their grandchild, they could not be the parent on the FAFSA. In those cases, we often have them indicate that they cannot provide parental information if the parent cannot be reached. We know there are different situations for students, so how do you determine which parent to include on the FAFSA? If the student's parents are married or unmarried but living together, the student will provide information about both parents. If the student's parents are divorced or never married and not living together, the student will provide information about the parent for which they lived with the most during the previous 12 months. Now we know there are joint custody situations where a student will split their time evenly among two parents. In those cases, the student will need to provide information about the parent who provided the most financial support. Now, in many cases, one parent may have provided insurance or transportation. Parents will need to look at the documentation to determine who provided the most financial support. If the student is living with a parent who has remarried and the step parent, they'll need to provide information about both the parent and the step parent, basically their household. If the student's parent is widowed, they'll provide information about the surviving parent. Students with undocumented parents who are eligible to complete the FAFSA must still report parental information on the FAFSA, and they can report zeros for Social Security numbers, income earned from work instead of tax information, and the parents will need to submit a paper signature page. Now we've moved on to the parent demographic section, and some of the questions are similar to the student demographics. A few questions of note. They'll ask if you've lived in the state at least 5 years. That's to determine eligibility for some financial aid. And there are the household size and number in college questions, and we're going to go through those. So who is included in the household? You'll include the student, the parent, any other children or other people living in the household as long as they receive more than half of their support from the parents and will continue to receive more than half of their support in that academic year when the student will be pursuing post-secondary education. In this case, 23-24. Now, the FAFSA does have some questions to help you determine whether or not you'll include people in your household. Who is included in the number in college? You'll include the student, but not the parents, even if the parents are attending post-secondary education. You'll include anyone else attending post-secondary education in the household as long as it is in a program in 23-24 that leads to a degree or certificate at a post-secondary school participating in Title IV federal student aid. Perhaps the student has an older sibling that is in post-secondary education. You'll not include students enrolled in military academies. We list out the financial information you're going to need for the FAFSA. We're going to talk about that as we go through the next sections. But one of the easy ways to complete the financial information is to use the IRS data retrieval tool. To do that, you must have a valid Social Security number. You must have filed a 21 federal tax return. Even though the student will be attending post-secondary education in 23-24, the Department of Education uses prior year for income information. So that's why we're using the 21 federal tax return. You cannot have changed your marital status since December 31 of 21. That's for security purposes and also to make sure the information is as accurate as possible. And you'll use your FSA ID to log in to the data retrieval tool. For the parent to begin using the IRS data retrieval tool, they'll indicate their filing status and they'll click on Link to the IRS. Then the parent will enter their FSA ID, username, and password. Once they arrive at the IRS website, They'll receive a warning message that they're using the data retrieval tool for the purposes intended. And then they'll receive this form. And here's where I recommend that you have your 21 tax return in front of you, because you want to make sure that this form matches exactly what you have on your tax return. If you spelled out street on your tax return, you're going to want to spell out street on this form. It must match exactly for the data retrieval tool to work. If you do get a match, you can hit transfer now, and the information will then be transferred over to your FAFSA. You will not see the information that's transferred from the IRS. You'll just see this phrase, transferred from the IRS. You may get a question about income earned from work, and here they want you to provide information about how much parent 1 earned and how much parent 2 earned. You can use your W-2s to input this information, or your K-1. The FAFSA does have information about where to find that information on your W-2 or K-1, and we provide a link here to additional information on how to complete this section of the FAFSA. If you filed a Schedule 1, that information will be transferred from the IRS. They will ask you additional questions about why you filed a Schedule 1, and they ask these questions because they may want to remove some of the income that you file a Schedule 1 for from the FAFSA calculation. You'll be asked additional financial information about combat pay, any grant and scholarship aid that was reported on the parent's income, any education credits or IRA distributions and pensions, or any tax-exempt interest income. You'll also be asked about any untaxed income. And we've listed out some of the more common types of untaxed income here on the screen. First of all, payments to tax-deferred pension and savings plans. Many people who contribute to pension or savings plans through their employer are contributing that pre-tax. So that is untaxed income. So maybe you have a retirement plan or a health savings account with your employer, and you're contributing pre-tax. You'll need to include those pre-tax dollars because that is untaxed income. The FAFSA does indicate to you where to find that information on your W-2. Other common types of untaxed income include child support received, housing, food, or other living allowances to the military, clergy, or others, or any veterans' non-education benefits. Depending on what they've seen on the FAFSA so far, you may get some asset questions. One of the questions they will ask is whether or not your assets exceed a certain amount, and that's a different amount for everyone completing the FAFSA, and you'll answer yes or no. Then you'll be asked about the balance in your cash, savings, and checking accounts, and they want to know the balance in those accounts the day you're filling out the FAFSA. In addition, you'll be asked about investments, including real estate and 529s, but you will not include your family home as an investment. In addition, you'll be asked about current businesses or investment farms, but you won't include the family farm or any family business with 100 or fewer full-time employees. Now, I wanted to discuss determining the value of assets. If you have a real estate investment, perhaps a rental house, and it has a market value, but you also have a mortgage against that rental house, you'll want to subtract that mortgage from the market value to determine the net value that you'll include on the FAFSA. And you can really apply this formula to any investment that has a debt against it. Depending on what they've seen so far on the FAFSA, they may ask the student to provide some financial information. And the student can also use the IRS data retrieval tool if they filed a tax return. The student will then be asked to review the information that they've provided on the FAFSA and agree to the terms which indicate that they have provided information that is accurate and true to the best of their ability, and that if they receive any federal funds for their education, they'll use it for the purposes intended. New this year is a demographic survey at the end of the FAFSA. This is optional, and the student can indicate whether or not they want to complete this demographic survey. This demographic survey may be mandatory in future years. The student will indicate how they want to sign the FAFSA, and if the student is logged into their account, this FAFSA may already be signed for them because they carry that FSA ID throughout the FAFSA. In that case, the parent will then need to sign the FAFSA with their FSA ID username and password. And then the student can submit the FAFSA, and they want to make sure they receive this confirmation page, and it will have a confirmation number on there as well as a data release number. I recommend that students print this page or at least take note of that confirmation number and data release number. The data release number identifies all of the information that the student provided on the FAFSA. And if the student wanted to add another school, instead of going in and adding that school on the FAFSA, they could contact the school they're interested in attending and give them that data release number, and then the school can pull down their information and prepare a financial aid offer for the student. As a student completes the FAFSA, there are several help options. As you can see, questions and answers at the beginning. There are help bubbles with each FAFSA question, a FAFSA help page, the Federal Student Aid Information Center hotline, and Mapping Your Futures 800 number. This is an example of what the student aid report looks like, and as we mentioned earlier, the student will get an email a few days after they file the FAFSA, and they can go in and review this student aid report. They can still make any corrections to their information if needed. What the FAFSA determines for the student and parent is the expected family contribution. The expected family contribution is what the Department of Education says a family can reasonably be expected to contribute to the student's education. It's calculated using that information that the student and parent have provided on the FAFSA and a federal formula. And they look at both what they think the parent can contribute and what they think the student can contribute. And it stays the same regardless of college. And so we're going to talk about how that expected family contribution is used in the financial aid office to award aid. The financial aid office will subtract the expected family contribution from the cost of attendance. And as you may recall, we mentioned cost of attendance earlier when we talked about housing plans. The cost of attendance can include tuition, fees, books, room and board, other living expenses, perhaps transportation, and maybe even some equipment for special programs. The financial aid office will calculate that, subtract that expected family contribution to determine whether or not the student has financial need. The financial aid office will award as much aid as they can to meet that financial need. I wanted to provide an example of what a student could receive in federal financial aid. Now, this is just federal financial aid. It doesn't include any state programs or institutional programs or any private scholarships. A first-year student could receive a federal Pell Grant of $6,895. That's the amount for this year. That could be different next year. And the student must, though, have need in order to receive a federal Pell Grant. It could be an amount less than that if the student does not have full need. All students who are determined eligible for federal student aid by completing the FAFSA could apply for a direct loan of up to $5,500. If the student has financial need, up to $3,500 of that could be subsidized. And that means that the federal government will pay the interest on that loan while the student is in school and during authorized periods of deferment. And that's quite a savings for the student. In addition, parents can borrow direct plus loans. They can borrow up to the cost of attendance minus any financial aid that the student has received. This is an example of a financial aid offer. Note that financial aid offers can look different from school to school. So if a student is comparing schools, it's important that they study these financial aid offers carefully. Know what are grants and scholarships, and know what are loans. Just a reminder, grants and scholarships typically don't have to be repaid, but loans do have to be repaid. Also, a student should be aware of any obligations or requirements of grants and scholarships and be willing to meet those requirements and obligations. I wanted to touch on some of the South Dakota programs. First of all, the South Dakota Opportunity Scholarship is a fantastic program in South Dakota. It does have eligibility requirements that include a minimum GPA, a minimum ACT, and curriculum requirements. But as you can see, it's $1,300 for 3 years and $2,600 for the final year. The application must be submitted by September 1st, but they do encourage students to have everything submitted, if at all possible, by June 1st. And I know that many schools in South Dakota and counselors help students get this information in as soon as possible. The Dakota Core Scholarship Program is tuition and applicable fees at participating South Dakota schools. The requirements include minimum grades and an agreement to stay in the state to work in specific critical need occupations. The South Dakota Needs-Based Grant Program requires that you be enrolled at least part-time in an eligible program. There is a grade requirement and a requirement of a completed FAFSA. The Build Dakota Scholarship Program is a very popular program in South Dakota. It is a full ride scholarship for those students enrolled in a high need workforce area program at one of the 4 technical colleges. The student must agree to work full-time in South Dakota for a minimum of 3 years. The next application cycle begins in January, but I know that many students are already working on this scholarship application. New this year is the Freedom Scholarship, which is a new statewide initiative to encourage South Dakota students of all economic backgrounds to live and work in South Dakota after graduation. The student must complete a FAFSA to be considered for the Freedom Scholarship, and right now there is not an additional application. The colleges and universities in South Dakota will award this Freedom Scholarship. The Jumpstart Scholarship Program is not for seniors, but for those students who plan to graduate from a South Dakota public high school in 3 years or less. That is the first year only for the student, and the dollar amount varies. The Critical Teaching Needs Scholarship Program. Under this program, a student must agree to work in South Dakota in a critical teaching need occupation for 5 years, and must understand that the scholarship will turn into a loan if the requirements are not met. I wanted to provide a few scholarship tips. I think scholarships are very important. I know it does take work for students to complete scholarship applications, but I recommend they treat it like a job. If a student spends 10 hours completing scholarship applications and wins just one $1,000 scholarship, that's like earning $100 an hour. So to be successful, a student needs to develop a plan, understand that cost of attendance, how much will it cost them to attend that institution, and use that amount to establish a scholarship goal. With that scholarship goal in mind, conduct research. And it's important that the student look at local scholarships, which are often some of the best scholarships for the students. Also, look at the college, school, or university that they plan to attend. Make sure they research the website to find out about all of the scholarships offered at that institution. Of course, we've talked about some of the state programs already. And then also be sure to check out employer programs. And that could be employer of either the student or of the parent. I know both of my daughters received scholarships from my employer and my husband's employer. Also, look at organizations or employers that align with the student's career choice. Many organizations, professional organizations, trade associations, want to see young people entering their career field, and so they offer scholarships for students that have chosen that career. And then finally, there are the scholarship search engines, and we'll list a few here in just a moment. We recommend that students prepare the applications carefully, take time to write the essay, make sure you have someone else look at that essay to proof and edit it, and remember that neatness counts on applications. To stay organized, use the Mapping Your Future Scholarship Tracking Sheet, and we'll have a link to that here in just a moment. Make sure you follow all of the deadlines and requirements. I know that some organizations that receive a lot of scholarship applications will quickly throw out those applications that don't meet the deadlines or requirements. And finally, we recommend having a dedicated email address, particularly for those scholarship search engines. That way, you can find out quickly if a scholarship search engine sends you an email notifying you that they've found a scholarship that matches your profile. And so you'll more likely see that if it's in that separate email. Also, if one of those scholarship search engines starts sending you marketing emails, you'll notice that right away and can unsubscribe if you want to. Here we list out several resources, including Mapping Your Futures resources and federal government resources for you. We also provide a link to the scholarship tracking sheet, as well as a list of scholarship search engines. Here's the Mapping Your Future contact information for you. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening to this presentation.